So Iran stands up in the UN today and warns the U.S. will not be spared if the war in Gaza continues, and that there will be uncontrollable consequences of the U.S. support for Israel. Now, it doesn't take a brainiac to know that we've got millions of people inside of our country that we cannot account for, have no idea where they were from, and we can't even talk about the gotaways. So I think it's important for us as preppers to understand what these invisible people could really mean. First and foremost, this is not fear porn. This is strictly educational, and I think we should take it that way. So I've got it broken down a very systematic way that I think you'll understand. So let's go ahead and get into it now. Lone wolf attacks are rare. There have been perhaps 100 successful, politically motivated attacks pulled off by a solo actor inside the United States since around the 1940s. But they began attracting special attention from the national security community more than a decade ago when Al-Qaeda started encouraging them. By 2010, then CIA Director Leon Panetta declared that lone wolf attacks could pose, quote, the main threat to this country. The next year, President Barack Obama laid out the problem, stating, when you've got one person who's deranged or driven by a hateful ideology, they can do a lot of damage, and it's a lot harder to trace those lone wolf operators. Now, researchers believe lone wolf attackers are fundamentally different than people who participate in organized political violence. In an effort to better understand the phenomenon, the Department of Justice has actually funded two groups of researchers to compile databases of historic lone wolf attacks so they can be analyzed for trends, psychological profiles, and the authorities hope insight into how to prevent them. Let's go over some of the things that they found. Trends in lone wolf terrorism. From 1940 through around 2000, the 38 lone wolf terrorists committed 171 attacks, claiming 98 lives and injuring another 305. An array of firearms and homemade bombs were used in the attacks, and roughly 60% of the lone wolves committed a single attack and 40% committed multiple attacks. From 2001 through 2013, the 45 lone wolves committed 45 attacks, killing 55 people and injuring another 126. These attacks involved not only firearms and bombs, but also airplanes, biological weapons, knives, and construction equipment. In short, the lone wolves have expanded their arsenal of weaponry in the post-9/11 era. While multiple attackers were prominent in the pre-9/11 era, the single attacker rose in prominence after 9/11. Modus operandi. When we start to talk about modus operandi, the most significant change involves the targeting of uniformed police and military officers. 12 law enforcement officers were killed and wounded by lone wolf terrorists in the last 60 years preceding 9/11. This figure doubled in the first 13 years following 9/11, when the number of law enforcement personnel killed or wounded by lone wolves rose to 24. All of these attacks were bracketed by the years 2009 through 2013. The years coincide with the Obama presidency. Lone wolf attacks against police before 9/11 were motivated by Black Power, the Palestinian question, and abortion, with one exception. Since 9/11, attacks on law enforcement have been motivated by anti-government and white supremacy anger over the election of the nation's first African-American president, which we all know is bull at this point. Not a single member of the U.S. military was targeted by lone wolf terrorists prior to 9/11. Since 9/11, lone wolves have killed or wounded 47 members of the military. Lone wolves have also attacked military bases or have been arrested in thwarted attacks against military installations. All of these terrorist attacks and plots were bracketed by the years 2009 to 2011. In every case but one, they were conducted by Al-Qaeda sympathizers angry over the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Weaponry. Prior to 9/11, a total of 234 victims were killed or wounded in bombings perpetuated by lone wolf terrorists, a phenomenon undoubtedly related to the bombing campaigns of terrorist groups during much of this period. Since 9/11, there have been only 6 victims of lone wolf bombings. This decline may reflect the stringent government controls on the purchase of bomb-making materials enacted in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing. Consistent with the relaxation of U.S. gun laws since the 1990s and the recent trends in mass shootings, the lone wolf's preferable weapon is now a staggering range of high-velocity firearms. Not only has the lethality of the firearms increased by an order of magnitude, but lone wolf attacks have also become more personal. Diversity of the lone wolf terrorism. Lone wolf terrorism is a multifaceted crime. In addition to the 171 attacks committed by lone wolves in the pre-9/11 era, they were also responsible for at least 34 threats of aborted attacks. Due to technological advances, the post-9/11 era has shown a great number of threats and aborted attacks. These have included anthrax hoaxes against abortion clinics and a presidential candidate. The aborted assassination attempt on President Obama was a radioactive bomb, and the downing of an electrical power grid represented in an innovation in American terrorism. Background factors. While there's no standard profile of the American lone wolf terrorist, the evidence indicates that most of them are unemployed, single, and have a criminal record. Compared to a member of a terrorist group, lone wolves are older, less educated, and more prone to mental illness. When compared to a member of Al-Qaeda, American lone wolf terrorists are more likely to be unmoored from society. The findings imply that lone wolf terrorism is caused by a relative deprivation. In their social exclusion, lone individuals feel deprived of what they perceive as a value to which they are entitled, and form grievances against the government responsible for their unemployment, discrimination, and injustices. Their violence is a deviant adaptation to this gap between means and goals. One reason for this relatively high level of alienation is that more than half of the lone wolves embraced certain ideologies or anti-government ideologies. Nationalistic movements such as white supremacy movements have tended to produce terrorists from the lower classes, while religious terrorists like Al-Qaeda come from all classes. The loci of radicalization. I know it's a fancy word, but we're going to figure it out here in a second. Identifying the locus or place of radicalization is important because it draws attention to the social institutions or means by which the individual is radicalized into violent extremism. The most common place of radicalization in the pre-9/11 era was an extremist group that the lone wolves may have belonged to but had since abandoned. For lone wolf extremists of the post-9/11 period, traditional places of radicalization have been replaced by informal online social networks, the civilian workplace, and the mass media. Motives. Lone wolves tend to combine personal grievances with political grievances. Personal and political grievances are important because they go to the crucial question of motive. To validate the commonality, there must be evidence of both personal and political grievance for any given case. For the pre-9/11 lone wolves, evidence of both themes was found in 30 of the 38 cases and roughly 80% of the cases. For lone wolves of the post-9/11 era, evidence of both themes was found in 36 of the 45 cases, again representing 80% of the cases, indicating that commonality is a signature of lone wolf terrorism that distinguishes loners from organized terrorists who share collective grievances. The end result of the radicalization is the same. However, for both lone wolves and organized terrorists, violence is considered the only alternative to an unjust system. Enablers. Lone wolves are enabled through either direct means in the form of people who unwittingly assist in planning attacks, or indirectly by people who provide inspiration for terrorism. While affinity for extremist groups is a vicarious experience best understood as ideological validation of beliefs, an enabler is best understood as a person levels as someone who either unknowingly perform tasks that make an attack possible, or someone who indirectly encouraged terrorism by example. Enablers are also common among group actors. Broadcasting intent. While lone wolves physically isolate from society, at the same time they communicate with outsiders through spoken statements, threats, letters, manifestos, and videotaped, or proclamations similar to the jihadist martyrdom videos uploaded to the internet by members of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Broadcasting intent can explicitly refer to an upcoming attack, or it can imply that an attack is imminent. Broadcasting intent may occur in the weeks, days, and even hours before an attack. Broadcasting intent may be the most important commonality from the standpoint of prevention. If lone wolves announce their violent intentions beforehand, then presumably steps can be taken to stop them. Broadcasting intent is pervasive among lone wolf terrorists. Evidence of broadcasting can be found in 84% of the pre-9/11 cases. The triggering event. The triggering event is a catalyst for lone wolf terrorism, and such events are common among terrorist group members. For lone wolves, triggering events may be personal or political or some combination of the two. Triggering events are sometimes sharp or immediate. Other times, events slowly accumulate over time through a series of escalation thresholds until the lone wolf snaps under the pressure, triggered by the act of terrorism. The commonalities of lone wolf terrorism. The commonalities form a radicalization model indicating that lone wolf terrorism begins with personal and political grievances, which become the basis for an affinity with an extremist group. This is followed by the identification of an enabler, followed by a broadcast of intent. Then final commodity is a triggering event or the catalyst of terrorism. What can we do? We can maintain our situational awareness. We can pay attention to the people moving around us. If things aren't right, then they probably aren't right. We have to protect our families. And unfortunately, this means that we may have to arm ourselves until the U.S. can get back on its feet. And while I cannot advocate for the use of violence, I can advocate for the protection of our families, our loved ones, and our friends. I hope this video has done something good for someone. Please take a moment, hit that like and subscribe button. If you'd like to support the channel, there are links below. You're all adults. You know what to do. And until the next time, stay safe, have a great day, and I'll see you when I see you.